When Calvin fell ill, I was abroad taking some time to relax. The 100th missed call came in. My 6 feet 2 inches male assistant answered the phone. "Where are you? Who are you with?" I heard Calvin's almost frantic voice on the other end. I couldn't help but let out a chuckle. "Didn't we agree to do our own thing? Why are you taking it so hard?" Chapter 1. Calvin and I were childhood friends who eventually became strangers. We had feelings for each other during our teenage years, but before we could ever address them, Calvin met his destined one, Fiora. Later, under pressure from the Lee family, Calvin's soulmate broke up with him right before graduation and flew overseas alone. Heartbroken, Calvin finished university with my company by his side. He then started his own business. As his career took off and he gradually gained enough standing to push back against his family, his unforgettable first love decided to return to the country and applied for a job at his company. For reasons I couldn't quite fathom, Calvin hired her as his personal assistant. It was right before our families were about to announce our engagement. Up until this point, it seemed like I was destined to play the villainous role, the scheming fiancé constantly making trouble for the heroine, only to meet a fitting end. But I wasn't going to do that. In fact, I understood Calvin quite well. After all, when I started following his lead and hired my own 6 feet 2 inches male assistant, I realized something important. People just need someone around who can understand and care for them. Especially those of us who live the life of a domineering CEO. Chapter 2. I inherited my family business earlier than Calvin. After all, during high school, Calvin spent 2 out of 3 years in a relationship. I never stopped studying. By my first year of high school, I had already mastered all the knowledge needed for college entrance exams. While Calvin was dating Fiora, chasing her around and holding hands, I was taking international finance courses under my mother's guidance. During summer vacation, Calvin and Fiora were racing cars along the river. I was flying abroad with my mother, attending finance-related seminars in person. After the college entrance exams, I effortlessly got into the school and major I wanted and began formally learning about the family business's operations and management. Calvin, on the other hand, was so heartbroken from the breakup that he failed his exams. The Lee family spent a lot of money to get him into a well-regarded private university for the wealthy. Coincidentally, it was in the same city as my university, even in the same district. Mrs. Lee asked me to take care of him. I agreed with a smile, looking at Calvin with a gaze full of warmth and affection. "I believe Calvin is just temporarily affected. No matter what happens, I'll stay by his side until he picks himself up again." The Lee family parents were satisfied with my response, and their looks hinted at deeper considerations. If Calvin continued to lack ambition, the best way to ensure he protected the family's assets was to have a woman beside him, one deeply in love with him and capable of bringing great benefits. After that, the Lee family let us have 3 projects in succession. My mother was equally pleased. On the eve of my departure for college in the capital, she called me to her study. "What do you think of that Lee boy?" she asked. "He's average," I replied. "Honestly, he doesn't compare to me at all." My mother burst out laughing and affectionately patted my head. "Alice, remember, when it comes to benefits, anything can be a weapon, even emotions. You can like someone, but that affection should never outweigh your goals and ambitions. As for the Lee family, if you want to play along, then do so. And if you really end up liking him, that's fine too. After all, who says you can only have one man?" I lowered my eyes, pondered for a moment, then smiled at my mother. Chapter 3. In Calvin's eyes, I was probably madly in love with him. When he was a freshman, to comfort him after losing Fiora, I would bring him breakfast outside his dorm every day. It was always hot soup and buns, just the way he liked it. At first he resisted and told me, "Alice, it was only after I met Fiora that I realized I always saw you as a sister. I will never fall in love with you, so please stop doing all these unnecessary things." I smiled without a word, handed him the buns and left. As usual, I posted on WeChat, visible only to the Lee family, "Morning workout done." I included a photo that discreetly showed part of Calvin's school gate. Soon enough, Mr. and Mrs. Lee both liked the post. Our families were negotiating a collaboration, and it was going surprisingly well. I put my phone away, zipped up my tracksuit, and continued my run along the leaf-covered path. I wasn't lying. I really was working out. A qualified heir needs to maintain good physical fitness, so I ran 4 kilometers every morning. Swinging by Calvin's school to grab him breakfast from a street vendor barely took any extra effort. Later, I started participating in various student entrepreneurship competitions, using them as practice for the high-profile ones. I would include Calvin's name as part of the team. It was a small gesture, but it moved Calvin deeply. One time when he was drunk, he confessed to me. He said, "Alice, I've realized for a long time now that you always stand in the shadows, silently supporting me. I don't want to let you down anymore." I turned my head away, pretending not to hear. When Calvin sobered up the next day, he probably regretted his impulsive confession. We both tacitly avoided mentioning it again. But he looked at me with increasing guilt. Of course, he wasn't the only one who felt guilty toward me. Calvin thought I was silently devoted to him because I was too busy to express my feelings otherwise. The truth was, I was preoccupied with keeping up good relations with a group of boys and girls who had connections to my family's business. Their needs varied. Some just wanted to copy my homework, others needed my name to reassure their families while they partied, and some sought emotional comfort. I was too busy to explain it all, which somehow led Calvin to believe that I loved him so humbly that I had lowered myself into the dust. Chapter 4. I did have feelings for Calvin before he ruined himself over his relationship with Fiora. Among all the people I kept in contact with for the sake of mutual benefits, Calvin was the one I paid the most attention to. I even cared about him more than I had set as my own boundary. No other reason. Back then, Calvin was brilliant and decisive, he was smart enough to shine effortlessly, and he treated me differently. Everyone around us assumed we'd end up together. Sometimes I'd find myself staring at him, thinking it wouldn't be so bad. But that all changed when Fiora showed up. Calvin skipped classes, smoked, fought, all in pursuit of freedom. As his grades plummeted, his skills in street racing improved. In the end, he ended up with a juvenile record for underage and unlicensed driving. "The Lee boy is ruined," my mother had said at the time, and I had agreed, immediately cutting off any genuine feelings for him. After that, everything went smoothly. With my encouragement, Calvin gradually pulled himself together. He still had some smarts left, and as the only son of the Lee family, they spared no expense in helping him. By the time he graduated, Calvin had managed to scrape together enough to rejoin the circle of us second-generation heirs. Then Calvin started his own business. I returned home to prepare to take over the family company. When Calvin's company began to gain some traction, he proposed to me. I smiled and accepted. Dramatically, the day after the proposal, Fiora, the heroine of his youth, flew back from abroad. After that, Calvin never mentioned our engagement again. He cautiously kept Fiora by his side, as if convinced that I'd go mad with jealousy and try to harm her. He went out of his way to keep us from meeting. What he didn't know was that the day after he hired Fiora as his personal assistant, I found someone for myself too. Someone more caring, more gentle, and more promising than Calvin. Most importantly, he came from a less privileged background, understood gratitude, and would never surpass me. Chapter 5. When Fiora came to see me, I had just finished a business meeting and was resting in the lounge with my assistant, Duncan. Duncan had a high level of perceptiveness, not just in work. For instance, when Fiora entered, he glanced at my expression and immediately left to buy coffee, leaving us time to talk. The time he gave us was enough for a conversation. I looked at Fiora sitting across from me. Her skin was smooth, her style was clean and sharp, her long black hair tied up neatly. From appearances alone, she was the type of unforgettable first love that had become somewhat rare in recent years. Back in high school, Fiora had stood out from the crowd of delicate girls with her rebellious attitude, catching Calvin's attention. Calvin used to say he'd never seen a soul as free as Fiora's, and he followed her without hesitation, beginning his downward spiral in pursuit of freedom. The thought made me smile. I relaxed into the couch, gesturing casually for her to speak. Compared to my relaxed demeanor, Fiora was tense and on guard. She quickly worked up her emotions. Soon after sitting down, her eyes reddened, and she looked up at me with a forced smile. "I heard Miss Moo and Calvin are getting engaged. I know Calvin feels very guilty about everything that's happened between us." Hearing her open with such a basic attempt at intimidation and probing, I couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. I rubbed my temples, interrupting her. "Fiora, what do you think of him?" I asked, pointing to the door. Fiora followed my gaze and saw Duncan standing outside. He was tall and lean. Even in a cheap suit, he managed to carry himself with an air of elegance. He held my drink carefully, his eyes never leaving me. From the moment he returned, seeing me look his way, Duncan smiled at me through the glass door, just enough to show his attachment without coming off as clingy. Of course, this wasn't Duncan's natural talent. He had taken the time to understand my preferences and practice to be able to stand before me as he did now. I knew all of this, but I didn't care about Duncan's true nature. As long as he made me comfortable, he could stay by my side. This was the difference between Calvin and me. He poured all his energy into chasing an idealized soul, unable to see through even the simplest facade. In the end, he was played by those below his station, perhaps predicting what I was about to say. Fiora's face turned pale, but she had no leverage against me, so she forced a smile and said, "This gentleman seems like a fine person, loyal to you, Miss Moo." "He's quite rare." "Rare?" I scoffed, interrupting her again. Fiora's expression began to falter, but I didn't care. I just smiled at her. "As long as I like this type, I can have as many of them as I want." Fiora understood what I meant and began to look visibly uneasy. Someone who appears kind, pure, different, and seemingly only for me might be unique to Calvin, but it's not what I seek. I will never place my ambitions in someone else's hands. With each word, Fiora's face grew paler, her grip on her bag tightening. "So, Fiora, you're aiming in the wrong direction." I leaned back against the couch and gave a small wave. The people outside immediately understood, entering the room and extending a hand towards Fiora, who had no choice but to hand over the recorder hidden in her bag. Throughout the entire process, Duncan stood by my side, handing me the still warm coffee. His eyes were only on me, as if everyone else in the room was irrelevant. I simply reached out and patted his head in satisfaction. Fiora could no longer hold it together. She grabbed the bag Calvin had recently bought her and fled. "Miss, she probably has more recording devices on her," the assistant beside me said respectfully. "It doesn't matter, she understands now," I said dismissively, then picked up the financial report on the table. I had known from the start Fiora was ambitious. She knew what she wanted and knew the best steps to take. Otherwise, when Calvin's mother approached her before graduation, she wouldn't have left so decisively. She took the money, went abroad for an elite education she otherwise couldn't access, and let time and nostalgia make her Calvin's eternal first love. Fiora had always been clear-headed. This little test today made her realize I wasn't her opponent. We weren't even in the same ring. What I pursued was entirely different from what she and Calvin wanted. I wouldn't go out of my way to oppose her, and she wasn't foolish enough to create a troublesome enemy for herself. Besides, I had always admired ambitious women. I could praise their ruthlessness in achieving their goals, as long as they didn't get in my way. Chapter 6. As expected, Fiora never approached me again after that. Instead, she clung even more tightly to Calvin, citing her insecurity as the reason. She convinced Calvin to refuse any events where he and I might have to appear together, which only made our indefinitely postponed engagement party seem like more of a joke. At the latest gathering between our families, Mrs. Lee issued an ultimatum to Calvin, insisting he attend the upcoming dinner. Calvin agreed, but halfway through, the Lee family butler received news that Calvin had been in a car accident. Calvin claimed he was seriously injured and needed to go to the hospital immediately. He hung up before Mrs. Lee could even ask questions. It seemed Calvin assumed I wouldn't be angry at him, that I would simply accept his poor lies and indifferent attitude. But this time it wasn't just about me. It was a family banquet hosted by the Lee family. His actions were a slap in the face to both our families. In front of the Lee parents, my mother and I put on grim expressions, but inwardly we were thrilled, hoping Calvin's behavior would become even more foolish. Mrs. Lee tried to save face, holding my mother's hand to say some comforting words, but my mother pulled away and left without a word. After all, she was a prominent figure in the entire South City business community. For Calvin to show such disrespect to an elder, she could have ordered the place destroyed, and it wouldn't have been too much. Mrs. Lee couldn't stop her, so she turned to me for help. I gave her a polite smile and stayed for the rest of the dinner, but I never said a word throughout the entire meal. To the Lee parents, I appeared to be suffering silently. As I was leaving, Mrs. Lee grabbed my hand and slipped the violet jade bracelet she'd recently bought at a sky-high price onto my wrist. I hesitated, refusing twice, but eventually accepted it reluctantly. "Alice, you're a good child. Over the years I've seen your feelings for Calvin. Don't worry, Calvin might be a fool, but the Lee family won't let you suffer." Hearing her words, I finally felt a genuine smile rise from deep within me. Chapter 7. When I got home, my mother was lounging on the couch in her loungewear, playing a game. I kicked off my heels and ungracefully shuffled over to her. "Done?" she asked. "Done," I replied. "This time at least 2 billion. Your reputation is worth every penny." I reached out to give her shoulders a squeeze. My mother narrowed her eyes in satisfaction, and I looked at her sharp features. Time seemed to have favored her, only carving out an even stronger presence despite its relentless march. Powerful, ruthless, cold. That was how the world saw her. and it was what I aspired to be. I remembered the day I turned 18, a man who claimed to be my biological father appeared. He handed me a cake wrapped in pink ribbon and told me that from now on, I had a father who would love me. He said, "You've been turned into a monster like your mother, but girls are supposed to be cherished. Now that daddy's here, you only need to be a beautiful princess." After he spoke, I smiled gently. He thought I agreed with him, his eyes lighting up, his excitement and greed barely contained. He had planned it well, appearing right after I gained official inheritance rights on my 18th birthday. If he could get my acknowledgement, he'd have the leverage to challenge my mother, but in the next moment, he was politely escorted out. I used some subtle means, ensuring he'd never have the chance to bother my mother or me again. Initially, I had gathered information on this so-called father, but after hearing his words, I decided there was no need to look further. I'd encountered plenty of people like him during my growth, and there was nothing valuable in his story worth learning. My mother had been open with me. I'd been conceived when someone set her up. That man was a stain on her life, but my existence wasn't a shame to her. You're my daughter, but you're also your own person. No matter what kind of man your father was, it doesn't define you. I respect all your choices, but I hope our ambitions align and you'll stand by my side. That way, our bond would be even deeper. I was my mother's daughter, growing wild and free, and her comrade in arms, so my goal was never to be just beautiful or loved. If you are strong enough, people will come to love you in droves. And you can freely pick the ones you like. Chapter 8. With the compensation from the Lee family, I secured 2 more projects in South City. As a reward, my mother registered a new company in a neighboring city for me, as an early birthday gift for my upcoming 26th birthday. To be honest, my methods weren't entirely clean, but the Lee family parents remained tolerant. Alice will be our daughter-in-law sooner or later, so why fuss over such things? Mrs. Lee said with a kind smile, and I responded with a bashful smile of my own. At any rate, Calvin wasn't agreeing at the moment, perhaps due to the increased pressure from his family. Calvin had become more rebellious, openly clashing with his parents on numerous occasions. Fiora leaving right before the college entrance exams had always been a scar that Calvin couldn't get over. That unfulfilled romantic chapter of his youth was an eternal regret in his heart. He told me that himself, with a wistful expression. I always thought that a youth filled with underage romance, drinking, fighting, street racing, and skipping school was best concluded with a stint in juvenile detention. But on the surface, I showed nothing but sympathy for him. Seeing my expression, Calvin gave a bitter smile. "Forget it. What am I even telling you this for? You're too innocent to ever understand." There were things I indeed didn't understand, but I knew one thing. Calvin was 130 pounds of stubbornness. When Mrs. Lee forcibly separated him and Fiora, he only clung to her memory more. Now, as his parents were eager to form an alliance with my family, they still forbade him from being with Fiora, pushing Calvin, desperate to protect his love, further toward the edge. Whether intentionally or not, Calvin's recent appearances in public with Fiora were all over the internet. In the photos, the two were far too close for a simple boss-secretary relationship. With the engagement party repeatedly postponed, rumors questioning our relationship were already circulating. And now, Calvin's behavior only confirmed the speculation that our family's alliance was crumbling. My mother took advantage of the situation to demand hefty compensation from the Lee family. Mr. and Mrs. Lee seemed to have grown tired of constantly cleaning up Calvin's mess. They issued an ultimatum to him. If he insisted on choosing Fiora, he would forever lose his status as the Lee family's heir. This threat might have worked in the past, but now Calvin believed he had enough power to stand up to his family. He publicly declared on social media that he would never again be a puppet for anyone, and now that he had the strength, he would protect the woman he loved. Despite his bold words, Calvin continued to enjoy the privileges of being the only son of the Lee family, but it was 2024, and the internet was full of savvy people. His comment section was filled with posts like, "No way. Is this guy really planning to cut ties with his parents who've supported him for over 20 years just for a fling? I heard he's an only child, and the Lee family poured everything into raising him, only for him to turn into a hopeless romantic. If I were his parents, I'd be furious too. LOL. Isn't he the guy who proposed to his fiancée one day, and then cheated on her with his secretary the next? A waste of resources. Raising him was worse than raising a dog. Seriously, these rich kids, his biggest worry in life is getting dumped before college entrance exams. Makes me want to fight these spoiled brats. Hey rich people, can you be miserable more quietly? You're disturbing my ghost. Can the Lee family adopt me? I swear I love being manipulated like a puppet. Please manipulate me with your wealth. Amidst the flood of criticism and mockery, Calvin quietly disabled his comment section. For the sake of the current business relationship between our families and for PR reasons, I decided to call Calvin. I wanted to discuss how we could resolve the situation, but the moment he answered, he began to mock me. What, aren't you supposed to be madly in love with me? Can't keep up the act anymore? Alice, I've already agreed to marry you, you should be grateful. Hasn't becoming Mrs. Lee been your dream all these years? I've given you the title, so stay out of my life. Can't we just do our own thing? You think you're some kind of authority over me, and it's disgusting. Holding the phone, I thought hard for a moment, confirming to myself once again that he had been the one to propose in the first place. Not something I had begged for. No, I can't be like you with no principles, I replied, hanging up decisively. Then I posted the recording of our conversation online, unilaterally announcing the cancellation of our engagement. The news spread quickly. I don't know if the Lee parents still thought I was head over heels for Calvin or if they truly had given up on him, but they made no attempts to do PR for him. Calvin and Fiora faced heavy criticism, and when Calvin called to ask me to delete the recording, he had clearly learned to control his tone and emotions, as if did he think I'd accommodate him? I blocked his number without hesitation and pinned the post calling him out to the top of my profile. After that, I focused on my work and didn't hear much about him. The next time I saw Calvin, it was in an unexpected setting. The project I'd been working on recently had gone well, and my mother gave me a 3-day break. I was barefoot on the beach enjoying the calming sound of the waves, when an angry voice called out from nearby. Alice! I opened my eyes to see Calvin standing a short distance away, glaring at me. Beside him was Fiora, who immediately looked away, clearly intent on staying out of whatever was about to happen. What's the point of all this? Why do you keep haunting me, following me everywhere I go? Did my mom send you to spy on me like some kind of dog? He was agitated, approaching me quickly. Fiora tried to hold him back, but he broke free, as he pointed at me and ranted about how no one could control his life and how he wouldn't submit even if his mother had sent me. Duncan returned. His fist arrived before he did. Calvin went down with one punch, his face instantly swelling. I quietly ended my call with Mrs. Lee, and while Duncan continued to pummel Calvin, I dialed her again, this time with tears in my voice. I'm sorry, Auntie Lee, I just ran into Calvin by accident and wanted to share some good news with you. I never expected him to get so agitated. I didn't even have a chance to explain. The chat window with Mrs. Lee stayed silent for a long while before a reply finally popped up. Don't worry about him, raising an eyebrow, I thought, so it seems the Lee parents have truly had enough of him this time. I remembered the rumors that the Lee family was planning to have another child, and it seemed Calvin really had been abandoned. Only Calvin himself seemed unaware. Pinned to the ground by Duncan, he kept shouting threats, his insults pouring out as if they cost nothing. The more he yelled, the worse the beating he received, and yet, he still hadn't learned his lesson, continuing to curse as if trying to batter Duncan's fists with his face. By the end, even Fiora was in tears, kneeling beside Calvin and pleading. Please stop, please, I'm begging you, just stop. Duncan ignored her until I spoke up. Only then did he finally stop. Chapter 9, Enough? I said softly, looking at Calvin lying on the ground. The once handsome face was now swollen like a pig's head. Only his eyes still burned with intense anger as he glared at me like he wanted to burn me alive with his gaze. Calvin, I came here just to relax. Running into you was a coincidence. Your sudden outburst has ruined my mood, and I feel quite unlucky because of it. It's best if we never meet again. My tone was calm, but Calvin seemed to be stung by my cold attitude. He froze, as if unable to accept this sudden change in my demeanor. Just as I turned to leave with Duncan, Calvin suddenly got up from the ground. Alice, he shouted my name, pointing at Duncan beside me. Who is he? I was about to answer when I felt a sudden force on my arm. I was pulled into Duncan's embrace. In that instant my expression darkened, but Duncan seemed unaware as he held me tightly, his posture overbearing as he looked at Calvin in the distance. Who I am doesn't matter to you. All you need to know is that Alice is my woman. He seemed nervous as he said this, his hand on my shoulder tightening to the point that it hurt a little. He was making a risky move, one that made him too guilty to even meet my eyes. Screw you, she's my fiancée. Calvin roared with anger, trying to charge towards us, but this time Fiora managed to hold him back. In the struggle, Fiora was pushed to the ground. Calvin snapped back to his senses, hurriedly picking Fiora up and leaving. "Let go," I said coldly, then slapped Duncan across the face without hesitation. I saw his fist clench under his sleeve before he released it. The row of black-suited bodyguards I had summoned were all standing in neat rows not far away. I turned and left, and Duncan hurried after me. But this time he was kept behind by the bodyguards. "Why?" I heard him shout loudly from behind. "Didn't you also like me?" I ignored him and returned to South City, surrounded by my bodyguards. Later, I swiftly arranged for Duncan to be dismissed from his position. With ample compensation, Duncan wasn't satisfied and eventually caused a scene in front of me. "I don't understand," he said, his eyes red, choking back tears. "I wanted to protect you, I just hugged you once." To him it was just a hug, but we both knew the truth. I didn't need him to put on such a protective display. And we both knew what would happen if I allowed such a probing gesture. Duncan's ambitions had grown too large, and his actions were out of line. What I despised most was people testing my boundaries. Especially when I had already given him enough. He performed well, and I rewarded him with money, a car, and a house, but he accepted everything I gave and still couldn't keep his initial promise of not crossing the line. Wanting more while already having plenty, it was a disgusting sight. Whether Duncan genuinely wanted to have a pure love story with me or he had his eyes on my family's company and power, it didn't matter. I wouldn't keep someone like that around. I could give him plenty of benefits, but I wouldn't allow him to try to rise to my level, to attempt to control me, or even to become my opponent. Thinking of this, I couldn't help but sigh. Indeed, men's promises were ultimately just words to be taken lightly. Chapter 10. When Calvin came to see me again, I already had a new assistant. Still 6 feet 2 inches, still with an innocent face, but even more obedient than Duncan. It was obvious that this was my current type, but Calvin seemed to relax at the sight, smiling at me. "I knew you hired him just to spite me. Now that you've dismissed him, I won't blame you. Let's not have any more of these tantrums in the future." His gaze fell on my new assistant and his brows furrowed again. "You should let this one go too. I'll have someone from my company assigned to you." I looked at his face, still bruised and swollen in patches. I gave my assistant a look, and he understood, stepping forward to politely ask Calvin to leave. Calvin's expression darkened and he looked at me. "Alice, what does this mean?" "I thought I made myself clear last time," I said, pulling out my phone to show him Calvin's earlier social media post where he declared he'd fight the world for Fiora. "Everyone knows by now that the engagement between our families is off. If the paparazzi catch Mr. Lee coming in and out of my company, it won't look good for either of us." I thought my words were rational and even a little considerate of Calvin's situation, but Calvin seemed inexplicably furious. His hand clenched repeatedly before he slammed his fist heavily onto the coffee table. "I thought you'd understand me, Alice. I always thought you were different from the others." He looked betrayed, as if I were the one who had cheated. I was ready to call security to throw him out, but given our history as childhood friends, I decided to try one more time to reason with him. "You should treat me like everyone else." "Why?" "Fiora has had a hard time abroad all these years. I'm just trying to make up for what I owe her. Why can't you all just accept her?" He seemed completely incapable of understanding, still rambling on, and I didn't hesitate any longer. I called the building's security. As Calvin was dragged out, I calmly reiterated, "Mr. Lee, the engagement between our families has been cancelled. We are strangers now, and I hope you don't show up at Moo Corporation again. You are not welcome here." Only then did Calvin seem to realize I was serious about cutting ties. His eyes went blank for a moment and he muttered, "Alice." Whatever else he was about to say was cut off as I had him thrown out. The world finally quieted down. I checked the time. Great, Calvin had wasted 40 precious minutes of my day. And now I'd have to stay late to make up for it. Chapter 11. Calvin and Fiora broke up again because Calvin's company went bankrupt, also because news came out that Mrs. Lee was pregnant with a second child. These two events were inevitably connected. After all, Calvin's initial success in business had been heavily supported by the Lee family. Realizing that Calvin was truly abandoned, Fiora swiftly took what was left of his assets and disappeared. This time, Calvin was genuinely devastated, becoming completely dejected. While he drowned in his sorrows, everyone else was busy. The Lee family was busy preparing for the new addition, While my mother and I were occupied with expanding our market share, in recent years, new trends had been emerging constantly, like the short drama series that became popular earlier this year. The profits were staggering. Not just us, but several major companies in the southern city wanted a piece of this lucrative pie. Last month, a few top streamers that the Lee family had signed to test the waters were reported for tax evasion and ended up in jail. Now everyone was cautious. One move and 100 competitors were ready to pounce. No matter how dirty and vile the fight for fame and fortune got, it was always dressed up in a glamorous facade. The Lee family sent another invitation for a family banquet. This time, the person delivering the invitation was one of the most outstanding young members of a Lee family branch. He also happened to perfectly fit my type, both in appearance and personality. At the banquet, Mrs. Lee deliberately seated him next to me. Seeing that I didn't reject him, she smiled with satisfaction. I knew what she meant. The Lee family also wanted to expand their market and didn't want to give up the alliance with the Mu family. But they had just disowned one heir, and the next one was still just a fetus with an uncertain future. Mrs. Lee wanted to secure me through this method. I played along but didn't explicitly say yes or no. Mrs. Lee was a little unhappy, but Mr. Lee didn't seem to mind. He was quite pleased with himself over the late arrival of a new child and had a few too many drinks at the banquet. Later, he couldn't help but say, "Your Mu family only has 2 women in charge. In the end, this business empire will have to change its surname." My mother smiled as she walked over, and under Mr. Lee's proud gaze, she poured an entire glass of red wine over his head. "Sober now?" she asked, still as graceful as ever. Mr. Lee knew he was in the wrong and suppressed his anger, apologizing to my mother. But his eyes still held nothing but disdain. This wasn't the first time. I had noticed long ago that whenever Mr. Lee looked at my mother, there was always an inexplicable mockery and arrogance in his eyes. This time, I didn't maintain my usual gentle facade. When my mother refused to accept his apology, I poured my own glass of red wine over the Lee branch member who had been trying to flirt with me. The young man's eyes practically popped out in confusion. I looked back at him with confirmation. Yes, I was venting my anger. "Sorry, but I don't trust your family's values, so there's no need for further discussion," I said. And then my mother and I left the venue together in a high-profile exit. The farce ended with a public apology from the Lee family. Over the years, the strength of our families had shifted from being evenly matched to the Lee family being left far behind by the Mu family. My mother let them stew for half a month before reluctantly forgiving them. The next morning, the Lee family sent another young man over. He appeared abruptly during my morning run, claiming it was a coincidence. I didn't reject him, humoring him like a cat playing with a toy as we jogged together. Before I could get much information out of him, a familiar figure appeared before me. It was Calvin. Long time no see. Having pulled himself together after the setbacks, he looked different from before. When he saw me, his eyes lit up. Before he could call out to me, his gaze shifted to the person beside me. Apparently they knew each other. The young man beside me greeted Calvin first, calling him cousin. Calvin ignored him, turning to me instead, his tone soft. "Alice, why are you with him?" I shrugged. "He's the new suitor the Lee family sent me. We're building rapport." Calvin froze at my words, then his expression darkened. He stepped forward, trying to grab my hand, but I evaded him. The young man beside me smirked smugly and stepped in front of me protectively. "Cousin, have you lost all your manners after wandering outside for so long?" Calvin grew anxious, raising his voice to call out to me. "Alice, I sent you messages. You saw them, didn't you?" "Messages?" My assistant had mentioned recently that my private inbox had filled up with spam. I wasn't interested and had told him to handle it all. Apparently, my moment of contemplation gave Calvin the wrong impression. He became excited again, looking at me with determination. "I get it. You're not doing this willingly. Wait for me. I won't let them manipulate you anymore." With that, he turned and left, leaving me and his cousin staring at each other. To figure out what was going on, I asked my assistant to recover the spam from my inbox. There were so many messages that he thoughtfully picked out the most representative ones for me to read. A quick glance told me all I needed to know. "Alice, I misunderstood you before. Fiora has been lying to me all along. Only you truly love me." I didn't even finish reading the message before I turned off my phone, afraid I'd lose brain cells if I read any more. Sometimes I truly admired Calvin. In recent years, the old money families in the southern city had all been transitioning their businesses to adapt to the new emerging industries. The second-generation heirs I'd grown up with had long since thrown themselves into this cutthroat silent war. Yet, despite everything, Calvin had fallen to this point, and all he could think about was love. Sometimes I wondered if he was the Lee parents' karmic retribution. Those two old foxes had never played fair, doing all sorts of dirty things to win in business. And now their son turned out to be a naive, useless fool. Chapter 12. I thought Calvin's words last time were just talk, but not long after, I heard that Calvin had returned to the Lee family. Even as a son who had been abandoned, returning wouldn't grant him any real power. My mother and I didn't have high hopes for Calvin, so we simply sped up our work. The projects the Lee parents had handed over to us in Calvin's name were filled with hidden traps. They never intended to let go of the Moo family. Had the engagement succeeded back then, those two old foxes would have found the perfect opportunity to make everything explode, bringing the Moo family down with them. Especially Mr. Lee, who never hid his ambitions. It was his subtle hints that led Calvin to approach me back in our school days. Little did they expect their son to be intercepted by a common girl at a prestigious school. Calvin went off to play the part of a domineering CEO, but the rivalry between the Lee and Moo families never stopped. We accepted everything the Lee family offered, but the traps they thought they had set would eventually ensnare them instead. We thought we'd have to drag this on for a while longer, but Calvin ended up giving us a big surprise. Mrs. Lee's unborn child was killed by Calvin. He was once again the only heir to the Lee family. As Mrs. Lee lay in the hospital, Mr. Lee already brought Calvin back into the public eye. His son killed his unborn sibling in a power struggle, yet Mr. Lee was not ashamed. He was proud. He believed Calvin had grown up, finally understanding the harshness of this world, and had become a true member of the survival of the fittest society. Honestly, at this point, even my mother and I thought he was a bit twisted. But remembering the things that old Fox had done in his younger days, it wasn't surprising. He was the least capable of his generation among the Lee heirs, yet he had clawed his way to the top by sending his two promising older brothers to prison through any means necessary, ultimately inheriting the Lee family. Such a person, once in power, was bound to be arrogant, looking down on his former rivals. When Mr. Lee brought Calvin to visit again, they expected me to run out of my room and throw myself into Calvin's arms in excitement. Instead, my mother and I flew to Paris for vacation, and the Lee father and son didn't even get past our front door. Calvin couldn't believe I would treat him like this and stubbornly stood outside my family's villa, refusing to leave. The more triumphant he had felt coming here, the more dejected he looked now. When the butler failed to persuade him to leave, he launched a drone from the yard to give us a full live broadcast. In the end, it was Mr. Lee, his face dark, who forcibly dragged him away. Then my phone started blowing up. I handed it to my assistant, who helped block one unfamiliar number after another. After we finished our meal, my mother elegantly wiped the corner of her mouth. I asked her, "Is it time to close the net?" She looked at me, a small smile curling at her lips. A play gets tiresome when it's dragged on too long. I lowered my head, setting down my knife and fork, and spoke softly. "Then let me settle this score for you." Chapter 13. Negative news about the Moo family had spread like wildfire across every platform overnight. The reason things escalated so severely was because someone accused my mother of hiring a killer, with me as an accomplice in hiding the body. The news claimed that 26 years ago, my mother had gotten pregnant before marriage due to a relationship that made her lose her mind. Afterward, to inherit the family business, she falsely accused the man of rape, sending her lover to prison. That man had lived like a rat all these years, but if he really had been a rapist, why would my mother give birth to his child? At this point, it seemed like the truth was out in the open. Moreover, the mysterious whistleblower revealed that on my 18th birthday 8 years ago, that man had traveled a long way to South City just to celebrate his estranged daughter's coming of age. But after that, he vanished as if he had disappeared from the world. After all these accusations, it was hard for people not to believe my mother had hired someone to kill him and hide the body. I listened to my assistant's report calmly, then turned to the person sitting across from me and raised an eyebrow. "The whistleblower accused me of being an accomplice. Do you think I am?" "Impossible." Calvin, who was sitting across from me, spoke slowly, his gaze at me deep and affectionate. "They don't know you. You're the purest, kindest girl in the world." Calvin seemed much calmer than before. I looked at the darkness in his eyes and stayed silent for a long time before I started laughing. "Calvin, maybe you don't understand me either." He didn't respond, just turned his head and stated his purpose. The Mu family is done for. The police are preparing to open an investigation. Alice, marry me, and I'll make sure your life stays the same as it is now." As he spoke, his eyes showed his determination to have me. "Let's wait a bit longer. Who knows, there might be a twist," I said, a bit dismissively. Calvin wanted to say something more, but he shut his mouth, looking at me with pity. He now understood his father's methods. If Mr. Lee was set on giving my family a lesson, then whether this matter was real or not, it would end up becoming real. The public demand for a thorough investigation grew louder online. I could understand their feelings. Watching the small squabbles of the wealthy was entertaining, but matters involving human lives had to be taken seriously. So when the police cars parked in front of the Mu residence, the entire internet watched closely. Many gathered outside the gates, live streaming on their phones. Everyone was waiting for a result, and the result was that the police found nothing at the Mu residence. 3 days later, Mr. and Mrs. Lee were arrested for attempted murder, and as the entire internet looked on, my biological father, whom everyone had been searching for, finally appeared. There had been no murder, no cover-up. 8 years ago, I bought him an island, and he had spent all these years farming and living in seclusion there. As for why he listened to me, from the moment he managed to evade the Mu family bodyguards and appear in front of me, I had told him that the people who sent him wanted him dead. He wasn't stupid. He quickly understood that his role was just a pawn in this power play, so he obediently accepted my arrangements, cooperating with me to make it seem like the Mu family had dealt with him. Mr. Lee thought he had this leverage and had treated the entire Mu family as his possession for years, until recently, when he had someone expose the past to teach me a lesson. I took the opportunity to withdraw some of the bodyguards protecting my biological father. His whereabouts were exposed, and in the past few days, he had experienced at least 6 accidents, car crashes, home invasions, and falling objects. He was genuinely terrified, crying as he managed to get my contact information, begging for help. Faced with my request that he come forward to testify against the Lee family, he no longer resisted. Not only did he reveal how the Lee parents tried to hire someone to kill him, but he also accused Mr. Lee of orchestrating the assault on my mother 26 years ago, which resulted in my birth. The purpose of this was merely to teach my mother a lesson, to make her understand that a woman's place was at home raising children, not competing with him in business. The 2 old Lee foxes ended up in jail. Calvin stood downstairs at my house through the storm all night, begging me to let his parents off. "I told you there would be a twist," I said, smiling down at him from the 2nd floor. "Don't celebrate too soon. The old fox won't go down that easily," my mother said softly from behind me. I smiled lightly and nodded in agreement. Chapter 14, I showed Calvin a clear path. Though Mr. and Mrs. Lee had fallen, the Lee family hadn't completely collapsed yet. Changing its head was just a matter of time. Things hadn't reached the point of no return. "Do you really have to be this ruthless?" Calvin's gaze bore into me, deep and unrelenting. I recalled the conversation we had half a month ago when he came to see me. I had asked him, "If the truth isn't what everyone believes, would you still help me?" His reply was, "Alice, don't overthink it. All you need to know is that I can protect you. I'll always be your safe harbor." The tenderness in his tone couldn't mask his true intention, to cage me like a gilded bird, keeping me solely for himself. Since that was the case, I could only reciprocate to the same degree. The day the Lee Corporation was reported for major tax evasion, I boarded a plane to Iceland with my assistant for a vacation. Misfortunes never come singly. Calvin was diagnosed with terminal stomach cancer. The reckless youth that led him to excessive drinking and speeding had finally exacted its toll. Years later, karma delivered its retribution. Calvin could no longer sustain the Lee Corporation. Shortly after, Mr. and Mrs. Lee were convicted of multiple crimes, including economic fraud, attempted murder, and leading an organized crime syndicate. By the time they finished serving their sentences, Calvin would already be 3 years in his grave. When the plane landed, my assistant informed me that Calvin had been calling me incessantly. After some thought, I answered. Calvin's voice was hoarse on the other end. He said, "I'm dying. Don't you regret it, Alice? From now on, no one in this world will ever love you the way I do." "Love me the way you do?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Like you did when you cheated the day after our engagement? Or like you did when you kicked me when I was down?" Calvin, you're barely qualified as a rival and even less so as a human being." There was silence on the other end. After a long pause, Calvin finally found his voice again. "Alice, you don't understand. I truly loved you. I just..." You just made the same mistake all men claim is unavoidable. I chuckled softly. It's fine, Calvin, I understand you with that. I gestured lightly to my assistant, who leaned his head against my hand and affectionately called me Miss Alice. Alice, who is that? Who is he? Calvin's voice erupted from the phone. I ignored his outburst and calmly said, Do you know the reason Fiora came back was because I arranged for her to learn about your recent success. I let her know her old flame had made it big and still had her in his heart. She eagerly came running. What I didn't expect was Calvin's complete lack of pretense. Instead of playing coy, he jumped at the chance to rekindle things with Fiora. Not only that, but he also took the opportunity to step on me, fabricating a fantasy of two women madly in love with him to fulfill his own ego. I'm speechless. Who even falls for men like him anymore? Count me out. Late at night my mother called. You did well. Her voice trembling with tears, I could hear the emotion in her words. I'm sorry for keeping you trapped in my hatred for over 20 years. From now on, I hope you'll live your life to the fullest and fly free. This is what I wanted to do, Mother. Born with your blood, taught by your hands and avenging you. It's all been a labor of love. I silently finished the thought in my heart, turning to gaze into the deep night. Memories resurfaced on my 18th birthday. A man with calculation written all over his face appeared before me. I didn't bother looking into his background. Instead, I had someone investigate who had sent him. Following the thread, I uncovered some old stories 30 years ago. In the business world of Nanshire, a rising star emerged. She was a confident, beautiful woman from a prominent family, highly educated, and with an ambition few could match. Her early life was filled with blessings, loving elders, a successful career, and a romantic partner she had chosen freely, but that seemingly gentle, respectful man, after being bribed by her competitors, he drugged and raped her, replacing her contraceptives afterward. Only after sending him to prison did she discover she was pregnant. At the time, her career was at a critical juncture. The company she had built from scratch was on the verge of going public. She planned to terminate the pregnancy, but her doting parents demanded she return home to have the child, to continue the family lineage. Simultaneously, her company's bid documents were stolen. Her rival stood before her, shouting for her to go back and have the baby, to fulfill her duties as a woman. The once glorious life she had built crumbled into a cruel joke. Parental love and romantic respect had always been conditional. Against power and profit, human emotions proved to be unreliable. That was her final compromise in life. 10 months later, she gave birth to a daughter and named her Alice. She left her family and raised her daughter alone, teaching her everything she knew. By the time her parents passed, she had single-handedly revived the family's declining fortunes and assumed control. Yet the mockery never ceased. No matter how high she climbed, her rivals always regarded her with condescension, waiting to drag her back down. But now those mocking voices and disdainful gazes had finally disappeared. Yes, even as a child, I had noticed the contempt in Mr. and Mrs. Lee's eyes when they spoke to my mother and the sadness that sometimes crossed her face. From that moment, I understood who my target was. I was 6 years old. I spent the next 20 years convincing Mr. and Mrs. Lee that I was hopelessly devoted to their son. Even the craftiest fox rarely suspects the sincerity of a 6-year-old girl. Not even my mother knew I had approached Calvin with deliberate intent from the start. But I will never forget. I am my mother's daughter, bound by blood and united in vengeance. My goal is to reach the heights my mother once dreamed of, not to be caged in the pursuit of beauty or love. This is my life's creed, unchanging and unyielding. The fall of the Lee family was swift and merciless, with Mr. and Mrs. Lee behind bars, Calvin's health deteriorating, and their empire crumbling under the weight of scandal and mismanagement. The once mighty Lee dynasty was reduced to ashes. The public, once enamored by their wealth and power, now turned their backs, reveling in the downfall of a family that had long been seen as untouchable. Calvin, in his final days, became a shadow of the man he once was. The once proud and defiant heir, who had fought so fiercely for his so-called freedom and love, was now a broken figure, confined to a hospital bed. His body, ravaged by cancer, could no longer sustain the weight of his regrets. Yet, even in his final moments, his thoughts seemed to linger on me. He called me one last time, his voice weak and trembling. "Alice," he whispered. "I never meant to hurt you. I just wanted to be free, to live my life the way I wanted. But now I see how foolish I was. I see how much I lost." His words were laced with a desperation that I had never heard from him before. It was as if, in the face of death, he had finally realized the cost of his choices. I listened in silence, my heart unmoved. "Calvin," I said finally, "you were never free. You were always a pawn in someone else's game, you just didn't realize it until it was too late." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment I thought he had hung up. But then, in a voice so soft I could barely hear it, he said, I wish things had been different." I didn't respond, there was nothing left to say. Calvin's regrets were his own to bear, and I had long since moved on. When the call ended, I felt no sadness, no anger, no relief, only a quiet sense of closure. Calvin's chapter in my life was over, and with it, the last remnants of the Lee family's influence. Chapter 16. With the Lee family's downfall, the Moo family's rise was unstoppable. My mother and I had played the long game, and now the rewards were ours to claim. The business world, once dominated by old money families like the Lees, was now ours to shape. We expanded our empire, branching into new industries and solidifying our position as one of the most powerful families in the country. But power, as I had learned from a young age, was not without its costs. The higher we climbed, the more enemies we made, the more we achieved, the more we had to lose. Yet I was not afraid. I had been raised in the shadow of my mother's strength, and I had learned to navigate the treacherous waters of power and ambition with the same ruthlessness and precision. My mother, now in her late 50s, began to step back from the day-to-day operations of the company, leaving me to take the reins. It was a role I had been preparing for my entire life, and I embraced it with a confidence that came from years of training and experience. Under my leadership, the Moo family continued to thrive, our influence growing with each passing year. But even as I took on the responsibilities of running the family business, I never forgot the lessons my mother had taught me. Power was not just about wealth and influence, it was about control over your own destiny, control over those who sought to undermine you, and control over the narrative that defined your life. And so, as I stood at the pinnacle of success, I made sure to keep a tight grip on every aspect of my life, my relationships, my business dealings, even my public image. All were carefully curated to ensure that I remained in control. I had seen what happened to those who let their guard down, who allowed themselves to be swayed by emotions or manipulated by others. I would not make the same mistakes.